It is the Resistance Report for March 27th, 2017. Good evening. House Intelligence Committee Chair Devin Nunes made some news today, Nunes News. He confirmed that the night before he came out publicly with the information that he said he received from a source, an intelligence source, that Donald Trump and Trump aides were inadvertently swept up in some sort of surveillance when the campaign was going on, that information that he got from a source, he actually got when he visited the White House grounds. Is this odd or is this odd? In other words, the night before, he announced publicly and then went to the White House with all this information that seemed in some way to reflect, or at least in some way justify Trump's charges, although it didn't at all, but it seemed at first glance to do so. He had the night before gone to the White House, and the source was there at the White House, on the grounds of the White House. Now, it's hard to understand something here. This really does sound like cloak and dagger. I mean, here you have the head of the House Intelligence Committee investigation, supposedly looking at whether there was any collusion between Trump's campaign and Russian operatives in terms of swinging the election of 2016 for Trump. The most serious interference in our democracy in history, perhaps, if it actually occurred. And we know that there is a lot of evidence that it did because of the testimony of James Comey that said they would not have begun an investigation were it not for credible evidence that this did in fact occur. Now here we have the head of that committee who goes at night to the White House. He goes alone. He takes, according to some reports, an Uber. And he meets a source on the White House grounds. Now, I've been to the White House grounds. When you walk around the White House grounds at night, well, don't do it. It's dangerous because there are a lot of police around that are instructed to fire at anybody who's walking around the White House grounds at night. So I don't know, I don't understand how Nunes could be walking around or be on the White House grounds and not be in the White House, but he says he was on the White House grounds and there was a source there, and the next day he gives this publicly. Now, he doesn't share this material with his committee. In fact, he still has not shared any of this information with his committee. He apologized, you remember, last week to his committee. He said he apologized for not sharing it with them. But when you apologize, if you're the chairman of a committee and you apologize, isn't there sort of an implication that you will then almost immediately turn around and share the information with the committee? He never shared it with the committee. So we don't know what this information is. Nobody has seen it except Nunes and this secret source who walks around the White House grounds at night. Now, I just want to get this straight, because I want you to get this straight. The congressman who's in charge of one of the major investigations into whether Trump and his aides colluded with Russia, interfering in the 2016 presidential election, got information from a source on the White House grounds. Now, this information deflects attention. The reason that Donald Trump originally tweeted that Barack Obama had wiretapped, and now he's saying it's not really just wiretap, it's surveyed in some way, well, undertook some surveillance. The reason that Trump did that, presumably, was to deflect attention from the underlying serious charge of collusion between Trump's White House, actually his campaign aides, and Russian agents during the campaign. And now you have the head of the committee that's supposed to look into this, who is actually at the White House getting information that helps Trump deflect attention from this underlying issue. Nunes, by the way, was himself on the Trump transition team. Now, is it possible that he can objectively run this investigation? In fact, I asked that today. I put out a tweet. Are we to really believe that Nunes can objectively run this investigation? And my tweet was retweeted by the ranking Democrat on the CIA subcommittee of the House Intelligence Committee, who said simply in response to my tweet, no. Adam Schiff, who is the ranking Democrat on the whole intelligence, the House Intelligence Committee, about an hour ago, he said that Nunes has got to step down or at least recuse himself from the investigation, for the same reason that Jeff Sessions had to promise to recuse himself from the FBI investigation, any oversight of the FBI investigation, because just like Jeff Sessions, Devin Nunes is now implicated. Public trust, by the way, is really the issue here. The public has got to trust that we're getting to the bottom of the most serious allegation that has come along about American democracy in recent memory. Certainly, I can't remember a more serious allegation undermining our democracy. The public is going to trust that we're understanding what happened, what the Russians did, what possibly connection, if there was any connection, between Trump and the Russian operatives might have been. Nunes cannot possibly run this investigation. He has got to recuse himself. Adam Schiff is exactly right. And what you need to do, and here I want to ask you once again to do what so many of you have done before and done so well, and that is to tell your members of Congress it's time to take Nunes off the case and put this in the hands of a nonpartisan, bipartisan select committee and an independent prosecutor in full view of the American people. Nunes is holding hearings this week, by the way. The Intelligence Committee, House Intelligence Committee, under Nunes, is continuing to hold hearings this week, but they're going to be in secret. So you will not know, I will not know, nobody's going to know what actually transpired in those hearings. Does this build public trust? Is the public supposed to feel that we're getting to the bottom of this? When Trump's own transition person, who's now in Congress, is ahead of this, the head of the House Intelligence Committee? No. Please, call your member of Congress and say no. Nunes has got to step down. He's got to recuse himself from this, and we need a bipartisan select committee and an independent special prosecutor. Now, what we try to do in the Resistance Report is to tie all of these pieces together, the news together, the strands together, so you can see the pattern. Here's another piece of a related story, and it is related, fallout from the healthcare fiasco. Trump, Sunday morning, his Sunday morning tweet, he said, Democrats are smiling in D.C. that the Freedom Caucus, with the help of Club for Growth and Heritage, have saved Planned Parenthood and Obamacare. Now, you want that translated? Translated, what that really means is that Donald Trump is furious with the so-called Freedom Coalition. That's about 36 Republicans. In fact, right now it's 35. One just dropped out. 35 House Republicans who refused to budge. They did not go along with Trump. They actually agreed in secret that they would all vote either for or against Trump, and they did not vote for him. They hung together as they agreed to do. Now, the thing you want to know about this Freedom Caucus, and also what you ought to know about the Heritage Foundation, Heritage Action, and Club for Growth. This is what irked Donald Trump. is that these organizations, Club for Growth and Heritage Action, have a great deal of say over the Freedom Caucus. Heritage Action, Club for Growth, have a great deal of influence over these 35 Republicans because so much of the money that supports their campaigns comes from the Club for Growth, as it's known, and Heritage Action. Now follow the money. Where does the money come from for Club for Growth or Heritage Action? Well, it comes from ultra-rich, right-wing donors like Peter Thiel, that's the largest donor for the Club for Growth, leverage buyout specialist John Childs, New Jersey investor Virginia James, and the Koch brothers and the Koch brothers network. These are billionaires that are supporting these organizations, Club for Growth, Heritage Action. They are right-wing ideologues. They decided they wanted the repeal of the Affordable Care Act without any replacement at all. Not because that was good for America, but because their ideological predisposition, these billionaires simply did not want the Affordable Care Act, period. Now, on the other hand, you have the business Republicans, those who are supported by, who patrons are big business and Wall Street. They are more centrist. You got these two groups of Republicans. Follow the money. You've got the Koch brothers, Peter Thiel, the right-wing ideological billionaires, and then you have the business Republicans, big business, Wall Street. You've got these two streams of money going into the Republican Party, into the Republican Congress. And this is the big fight. Donald Trump thought he could get enough business Republicans. He did not see how hard-edged and absolutely immovable these right-wing ideological Republicans would be, who wanted repeal and didn't want replacement. So this is the biggest split in the Republican Party right now. Big business and Wall Street versus the Freedom Caucus Republicans. Notice, by the way, that Donald Trump's white working class voters, they're not part of any of this. They were sold a gigantic bait and switch bill of goods. They are not even being considered and weren't even being considered in all of this. They're going to try a tax reform next. How far do you think they're going to get with tax reform? Well, the Republicans called Trump's bluff. When a president says he is going to support something, wants it done, and his party is in charge of the House or the Senate or both, as the Republicans are right now, when they say back to that president, we're calling your bluff, we're not going to go along with you, do you know what that does to the president's power? That power deflates, it melts, like the wicked witch of the West. Presidential power is a matter of expectation. How much power people think a president has. When you call a president's bluff and the president can't do anything about it, isn't able to do anything about it, that means the president's power is diminished that much more. So look at tax reform. The last time we had serious tax reform in this country was 1986. You know how hard it is to do tax reform? You think it's hard to come up with a health care plan. Yes, that is hard. Tax reform is just as hard. You've got so many coalitions, you've got so many interest groups in the Republican Party, not just the ideological right-wing Republicans, but you also have the business Republicans. And inside the business Republicans, you've got different industries, different interest groups. You've got the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. You've got the financial community. You've got big business, the chemical industry. You've got the pharmaceutical industry. You've got every industry wants to keep its special tax breaks and looks at this as an opportunity to get even more tax breaks. They're all going to cash in their chits that they have from supporting members of Congress. And when they all smell tax reform in the air, they all, and all their lobbyists are swinging into action. They all smell the possibility of special tax breaks, And that's why tax reform is almost impossible. And if you got a lame president whose bluff has been called, who actually is injured, where does the leadership come from? It doesn't come from anywhere. They're going to try to get a corporate tax cut. Just a general corporate tax cut. You know, the problem with trying to get a corporate tax cut, the problem is, in order to get it through the Senate with only a majority, 51 votes, it's got to go through something called reconciliation. That means that it cannot increase the budget deficit over 10 years. Now, that itself is going to make life very difficult. Donald Trump wants to increase military spending by 10%. If he wants to do that, how is he going to cut taxes of big corporations as much as he wants to cut their taxes and not explode the budget deficit? He can't do that. There are deficit hawks in the Republican Party that are going to resist him even trying to do that. In other words, you've got both the mathematics of this thing, but you've also got every lobbyist in Washington jumping into the fray. It's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, and Donald Trump is setting himself up for another big loss. House Speaker Paul Ryan, in his press conference following the rise of the bill to so-called replace, wasn't really ever going to replace the Affordable Care Act, he blamed Republicans who failed to grasp that the Republican Party is now, in Paul Ryan's words, it's now a governing party. Here's what Paul Ryan said. We were a 10-year opposition party where being against things was easy to do. This is Paul Ryan's words. Now, in 3 months' time, we tried to go to a governing party where we actually had to get 216 people to agree with each other on how we do things. It is the growing pains of government. That's the way Paul Ryan explained and justified why the Republicans could not come together. The growing pains of governing. The growing pains. That is absolute rubbish. The reason Paul Ryan could not get 216 votes, even though Republicans had many more than 216 votes in the House, the reason he couldn't do it is, number one, it was a lousy bill. It was a terrible bill. And a lot of Republicans were scared of the fact that 24 million people would lose their health insurance over the next 10 years, and 14 million would lose their health insurance next year when most of them, in fact all of them literally, are up for re-election. And then you have, as I talked about, the Freedom Caucus that did not even want to replace the Affordable Care Act. It's not growing pains. It was a lousy bill to begin with. And on top of that, it's not simply that the Republican Party has been in opposition too long and it needs time to learn how to govern. No, Paul Ryan, you should know the truth, and you probably do. The reality is that Republicans don't like government. They don't want to govern. Governing suggests a responsibility for government. If you are elected because you don't like government or you hate government, you don't know and don't care about governing. That's the problem the Republicans face. They're not going to get in the habit eventually of governing. It's not that they're growing pains. Paul Ryan, the assumption, after a time, we'll get it. We'll understand it. It's not growing pains. They have a chronic incapacity to govern because they dislike governing. They dislike government. It's not that they have a different governing philosophy. They don't have any governing philosophy at all. Sadly for them and the rest of the country, they also supported a president, and they came up with a presidential candidate in 2016 who has no conception of how to govern either. He also has been in the opposition, and he doesn't care about governing. All Donald Trump cares about is his ego. All Donald Trump cares about is winning. Whatever that means, even though he's a big loser. By the way, it turns out, remember that meeting with Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, last week between Donald Trump and Angela Merkel? Last weekend. That meeting, it turns out, is even worse than we thought. According to London's Sunday Times, Donald Trump handed Merkel a bill for more than $300 billion that Trump said Germany owes NATO. And the way Trump figured that was he took the amounts that he thinks Germany has fallen short in its payments to NATO since 2002 and then added in interest, and it came to $300 billion. Now, first of all, this is not the way two heads of state, who are among the most powerful heads of state in the world, treat each other. It's not the way the United States president treats the Chancellor of Germany. You don't hand her a bill for $300 billion and say, oh, by the way, I just calculated this. The United States, secondly, is not in charge and has no authority for collecting what other nations presumably might owe to NATO. That's not the role and responsibility of the United States. And thirdly, Germany does a lot of things that the United States doesn't do to help the world, not only taking in refugees, but as the German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen said in a statement, quote, defense spending also by Germany goes to UN peacekeeping missions, into our Eastern European missions, into our contributions to the fight against ISIS terrorism. My message to Germans and to others around the world: Donald Trump is an international embarrassment. I want to assure our allies around the world that Trump does not represent the views or values of most Americans. And we are doing everything we can, if you get my drift. Okay, now to your questions. Peter Escada, what can we expect from tax reform? Well, I got to it a little bit, Peter, in my discussion tonight. Right now, though, one thing I didn't say, the prevailing corporate income tax, corporate income, is 35% officially. But if you look at the average effective rate, what big corporations really pay in the United States, it's much closer to 25%. And if you're really a big corporation, you're probably paying far less than that. We have a lot of big corporations that are paying nothing because they're hiding so much of their income abroad in tax shelters, in tax havens. So this whole notion that American companies need a tax break, that American companies are somehow penalized in international competition, is absurd. American corporations have never done as well. Corporate profits are at a record percent of the national economy right now. Penny Timmerman, will Trump's wall along the U.S.-Mexican border become a reality? Penny, I doubt very much, because the estimates of the cost of that wall vary between $18 billion and $25 billion, and Mexico is not going to pay for that. Mexico has made it very clear it's not going to pay for it. So where's that money going to come from? Donald Trump is not going to pay for it. So here's what I expect. I expect there will be a show, a Donald Trump kind of spectacle. Yes, they'll be digging out there, there'll be concrete, they'll be starting to put up a wall, and then Donald Trump will make known to the public that a lot of that border is already walled, or there's barbed wire fence And he'll say, well, that's part of my wall. And then another part of the border is just not, you can't get across it. It's just, it's impossible to cross. Well, Trump will say, we don't really need a wall there. And then he'll say, but, I succeeded in my wall. He's a con man. Ian Miol. Mr. Reich, in a recent post you discussed things that Putin might want Trump to do. Could Trump actually do these things unilaterally? Ian, I mentioned things like getting rid of or easing the embargo that the United States imposed on Russia, or allowing Russia to be more belligerent and take over even more of Ukraine, or allowing Russia to get a corridor to its Baltic seaports. Well, some of that Trump can do unilaterally because a president is in charge of foreign policy. The embargo Trump would have to do with Congress, but Congress defers to presidential authority to a great degree. So most of what I believe Putin would like from Trump, Trump can deliver if Trump wants to deliver. Susan Bedingfield. Can Trump's agenda and appointments be halted while he is under investigation? Susan, they could be theoretically if the Democrats were in charge of the House and the Senate, but the Democrats are not. The Democrats can try to filibuster, but most of those appointments are subject to only 51 votes, and the Democrats don't have that kind of power. The Republicans have more than 51 votes. And in terms of the rest of the agenda, the Democrats can, again, try to filibuster much of it and will, but it's not a matter of the president being under investigation or not under investigation. Democrats don't have the power right now, which is where you come in, Susan, and many others. The midterms are critically important. James Farley. How would the public option for health care actually work? Now, James, I suppose you're talking about if the Democrats wanted to work with the Republicans and the Trump administration on enlarging or making the Affordable Care Act work even better, how would a public option be part of that? Public option basically says to people, and it would say to anyone who is on one of those healthcare exchanges where you choose your health insurer, it would provide an option into Medicare. Now, we know that the costs of Medicare, the administrative costs of Medicare, are far lower than the administrative costs that private for-profit insurers face. And that's why private for-profit insurers, when the original Affordable Care Act was being debated, did not want to go there. They did not want an option that people could use to get Medicare for themselves. But right now, we're back to ground zero in terms of what the Republicans have accomplished. And so maybe, just maybe, I think it's a very low probability, but maybe Trump will say to the Democrats, look, I think I can get enough Republicans if you will help me, and I want to actually strengthen the Affordable Care Act. Now, don't hold your breath. I think this is very unlikely, but it's not out of the question. Maureen Sugarman, if Donald Trump is impeached, who is in line of succession to actually succeed Donald Trump? Well, that would be Mike Pence, the vice president. Now, some of you have written me and said, well, wouldn't Mike Pence also be pushed out because an impeachment of Donald Trump would imply that all of Donald Trump's appointments, including the vice president, would be under a cloud of suspicion? Same kind of problem. No. Historically, and the Constitution, where's my handy-dandy Constitution? The Constitution calls for impeachment. Any officer of government, including the president, can be impeached, but these are separate impeachments. You can't, and nobody has contemplated, the founders did not contemplate an impeachment of the president and vice president together. They would have to have separate grounds for impeachment. Sue Kerr, and this is the last question. Why is the stock market behaving as it is behaving? Why is it going down? And is it related to what is happening to Donald Trump? Sue, there is a relationship. Because as I said, given that Donald Trump's standing in Congress, with Congress, has dropped precipitously after they called his bluff, his opponents in Congress, and got away with it on health reform, so-called, Donald Trump may not be able to get his tax cuts through Congress. And every lobbyist is going to jump into the fray, which means that a simple, easy, clear corporate tax cut seems less and less likely. The reason that stock prices were going up is because of the expectation that corporate profits would go up. And corporate profits were expected to go up because of the expectation of a big corporate tax cut. If it is less likely that we are going to have a big corporate tax cut, then it's less likely that corporate profits will go up, and it's less likely, therefore, that share prices will go up, meaning that today's share prices, which reflect anticipated future share prices, are going down. Donald Trump is injured. Don't rejoice. Don't rejoice for two major reasons. Number one, we have a crisis of governance right now in this country. We need to have somebody in charge. There is no grown-up in charge right now. Now, it is probably better to have grown-ups who are real grown-ups than someone who is a pathological narcissist and a sociopath in the Oval Office and ideological crazies in the Republican Party in Congress. Nevertheless, we don't have a governing structure. There is a crisis of governing right now in America. That's not great. That's a problem for all of us. Secondly, Donald Trump still has a lot of power. If you look at his cabinet appointments, I mean, look at Jeff Sessions in charge of the Justice Department, or Scott Pruitt in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency, or DeVos in charge of education, or go down the list. They can do so much damage through repealing regulations, or putting in new, stupid regulations, or basically not enforcing the laws they're supposed to enforce. And Congress can do huge damage. Which means that although, yes, take some pleasure if you want to take pleasure in Donald Trump having a terrible week last week. Yes, of course. But still, remind yourself that our job to both resist Donald Trump, resist the Republican Congress, and also push forward on social justice, on the environment, on issues that are critically important to the future of this country, to our children and our grandchildren. Our responsibility doesn't go away. Indeed, it is greater than ever. Keep up the fight. That is the end of tonight's Resistance Report. I'll see you tomorrow.